Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un recently suffered a public embarrassment. He wanted to show off his new destroyer, but it was damaged. The destroyer program of North Korea has suffered a setback, but Kim Jong-un has no intention of stopping the development of it. Ramon Pacheco Pardo, a professor of international relations and at King's College London, told me. According to him, it is obvious that the Russian ruler Vladimir Putin is helping the DPRK in the military field. And the US and its allies, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines and Australia, now have to reckon with the fact that if North Korea gets involved in any conflict in the Pacific, Russia can also be part of it. Does it mean that the World War III can start in the Indo-Pacific? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. Ramon, after Kim Jong-un, the whole world also watched as the new North Korean destroyer was destroyed during its launch. What is your assessment of this event? What does it mean for the regime, if anything, and for the modernization of the North Korean Navy, which now appears somewhat hasty?
I think that it shows two things. One of them, the ambition of North Korea, that it wants to develop as many capabilities as possible. And I guess this is because even though it has nuclear weapons, it is true that when it comes to other capabilities, it is behind South Korea, never mind the ROK-US alliance. So I think there's that aspect to it. And I think the other aspect to it is that North Korea is not foul-proof, right? It is still trying to improve its capabilities. It may not always work in the way it wants, and that's what we saw with this destroyer. But having said that, I also think that North Korea will try to continue to work in this space. And I also think that this confirms even further that it is receiving outside help because it is developing capabilities quite quickly, and capabilities that in the past we thought North Korea wouldn't possess or would take longer, they're developing them more quickly. So I guess the assumption is that this is coming from Russia, really.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about this, but just two more questions related to this event. Is it somewhat an embarrassment for Kim Jong-un, or we are maybe reading too much into it?
I think it is, and that's why he reacted the way he did, with some of the officials involved in this failure being removed from office. On the other hand, I think we should exaggerate in the sense that North Korea continues to improve its capabilities. So in a sense, it's similar to when South Korea has a missile test that fails, but it is still improving its capabilities. So I think that's something to consider. Yes, this obviously, in this case, the destroyer program or naval program of North Korea has suffered a setback, but I think it will continue to power ahead, right? And I think that Kim Jong-un has no intention to stop development of these other programs.
Yeah, and of course, accidents happen in its military. We saw in last 2 months, like US losing 2 jets that fall over the board of the aircraft carrier. So yeah, those things simply happen. But according to media reports, 4 people were arrested. What do you think will happen to them, considering the nature of the North Korean regime? Is their execution a likely outcome?
With Kim Jong-un, we don't know. I think with his father and grandfather, it was a very different situation because they are probably executed or purged and maybe sent to the countryside. But I don't think we have seen this with Kim Jong-un. We have seen that sometimes have been purchased, certainly. But sometimes those who have been removed suddenly have reappeared. Because I think Kim Jong-un, compared to his father especially, I think he understands better that failure is part of the process. And I think that's something that we have seen even with the nuclear and missile program, where sometimes it looked like someone had been purged, and then after a few months or even years, they reappear.
So let's examine how Russia's large-scale invasion has changed North Korea. North Korean soldiers are now fighting in Europe, a development that I think generally surprised many. Pyongyang has also become a significant weapons supplier for Moscow. What is Kim getting in return from Vladimir Putin?
My impression is that he's getting everything he wished for, except probably the latest nuclear technology and probably even the latest missile technology. He's yet to receive it. But apart from that, I mean, he's receiving, I think, support with a conventional weapons program, even with the missile program. I think he's receiving support. I think he's also receiving support, and economic support, of course, food support, energy. And I think he's also receiving support with the missile and nuclear program. But I think we look at, for example, the most modern missile guidance systems, for example, re-entry guidance systems. He doesn't seem to have received that. We haven't seen an indication that this is the case. And even when it comes to nuclear technology, as you know, we're not entirely sure that North Korea has been able to fully successful in the militarization of nuclear warheads. And so far, we have no indication that he has received this from Russia. It doesn't mean he hasn't, but, with other technologies, we have seen him test them, which I think shows us that he's received them from Russia. Other than everything else that I said, I mean, and obviously, apart from that, there's also diplomatic support in the sense that North Korea now can conduct any missile test, any sort of test it wanted to without fear of the UN Security Council imposing any new sanctions. I mean, I think it's clear that sanctions are not being imposed by Russia anymore. There is no monitoring because Russia refused to allow the UN monitoring mechanism to continue to operate. So it's quite substantial what he's receiving.
Ramon, a few months ago, when I asked you about the North Korean deployment to the Ukrainian battlefield, you responded that you wouldn't say that this is a global conflict, but it cannot be said that it's a European conflict only anymore. Even if it is not a global conflict, what does it mean for the world that it is not just a European war? What does it mean for the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, I think that refers to the fact that for many countries, they still don't want to get involved. I think North Korea is significant. Not only North Korea, of course, other countries such as Iran also providing support to Russia is significant for them because it's strengthening their ties with Russia. So for the Indo-Pacific, I think this means that the US and its allies, South Korea, Japan, Philippines, Australia, now they know that in any conflict in the Indo-Pacific, were North Korea to get involved, for example, what if China launches an invasion of Taiwan and North Korea takes advantage of this, it is an invasion of South Korea, then you will see Russian involvement. And I think that's quite important to note that we are going to see more tensions, we're seeing more tensions really in the Indo-Pacific. And I think what we're seeing here is that with these more growing tensions in the Indo-Pacific, we also see that Russia is a player that in the past many would have thought as secondary, but now you can't say secondary anymore. But that's really not the case. We'll be involved in support for North Korea and support China as well, of course, given the relationship between both of them. So it's something that we need to counter. I mean, this could be cyber capabilities. It could be the potential future transfer of missiles or artillery shells from Russia to North Korea. Here we're going to see transfers going in both directions. Once, I don't think we'll have a peace deal in Ukraine, but we'll have some sort of agreement, ceasefire. We may even call a peace deal. I think that's something to consider as a player in the Indo-Pacific, which of course Putin always wanted. But in the past, I think there was a skepticism about it. But I don't think you can say there's a skepticism about this anymore. It is a player, not only because of its relationship with China, but also because of North Korea.
Ramon, you mentioned quite an interesting and also pretty scary scenario that if China will do something in the Taiwan Strait, North Korea may take advantage of this, and then also Russia will be involved. And of course, there is a US element into it, definitely. Yes. And maybe also some European, which is hard to know. But it still look like what you just described. It still look like that would be a global conflict. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think in the Pacific or Asia and the Pacific, you would see more actors involved. I mean, I don't see how India has clearly decided not to take sides, at least openly, in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. But if something happens in the Pacific, I think there is no way that India couldn't be involved as well. I think if something happens in the Indo-Pacific, I also don't see Europe would be involved, right? Only because of the sheer economic importance of this region. So I do think that it would be more global because most countries would be affected. And I think countries that had decided to sit on the sidelines of Russia's invasion of Ukraine would find it extremely difficult to do so with the conflict in the Pacific. I also have to say, I think the US, those countries that have decided not to be involved in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the US hasn't really put the pressure that they could have for them to get involved. And I think if it comes to a conflict between China and Taiwan, the US would actually put pressure on other countries. Because for the US, as it considers to be China's primary enemy. I think it would be difficult for other countries not to be involved, even if they didn't want to, because the US will press ahead with it.
Apologies, now I will probably sound too apocalyptic, but can the World War III start in the Indo-Pacific?
I don't think there's going to be a conflict anytime soon. So I don't think I share the assessment of some US policymakers and experts, that they were doing about 2027. Now some of them are doing about 2029. So, they give different dates when China may decide to invade Taiwan. I mean, in my case, I was in the region, I think, until 2-3 weeks ago, and I went to Taiwan, China, South Korea, and Japan. I don't think there's the perception within the region that the conflict is coming up anytime soon. But I do think that if there were to be a conflict, I think North Korea probably would have an incentive to try to strike on South Korea, because obviously the US would be in a very different position. It would be occupied with China, and it would be leading the defense of Taiwan. And that's something that we need to consider as well, that when it comes to Russia, the Biden administration was very involved, but clearly the Trump administration thinks that this is not its war. But if something happens with China, it will be the US leading, for example, the defense of Taiwan. And that's where I think that North Korea would have an incentive. And China may even incentivize North Korea to do so, because it can also help to distract South Korea, which is a US ally, could potentially distract Japan as well. If North Korea decides that they also want to raise tensions with Japan. So there are these variables that I think in the case of Russia, we haven't seen them play out.
So let's return to North Korea. Is the North Korean army becoming, let's say, more dangerous as it gains real combat experience? And what implications does it have for South Korea?
I think it's becoming more dangerous because, when we saw the first deployment, North Korea suffered very heavy casualties very quickly. But, we have seen other deployments. It seems that they're performing better, and that's the messaging we're getting for Ukrainian soldiers fighting against North Koreans. For example, the way they defend themselves against drones, which in the beginning, they were really not doing this, but that has clearly changed. So yeah, they're becoming more dangerous from that perspective because they're becoming better at the battlefield, right? So there is that component. And there is a second component, which is the South Korea matter, right? I don't think North Korea can match South Korea yet. And it would be a very different type of war, as you know, because the territory is completely different. Obviously, Korea Peninsula is much a smaller territory than the Russia-Ukraine border region. It's also very mountainous, so it's very different. And frankly speaking, we would have to see how committed North Korean soldiers are to fight against South Korea. And it's not all clear that they would be that committed, right? And we may see defections. But obviously, we have to take it more seriously because now they do have combat experience that they hadn't had for decades. So yeah, that's something we clearly need to consider from a South Korean perspective.
Do you think South Korea will become increasingly interested in developing nuclear weapons? Also taking into account that, let's be honest, we don't know what we can expect from Washington these days.
I agree, yes. I think they are much more interested, yeah. This came up in the latest presidential debate, and the conservative side, even Kim Jong-soo, the conservative candidate, even though he's trailing in the polls, but he made very clear that's something that he would consider. Talking to the US, of course, he said that, but still, he would consider it. And I think that's something that has become more open as well. And that's quite important to notice too that, in the past, these discussions are not new. I've heard these discussions for a while, but now they have become more open and you have a presidential candidate openly talking about it, which means also the Kim Jong, the favorite in the polls, liberal candidate, even if he said he doesn't want to, or he has implied he doesn't want to, but it's a question that will come up if he becomes president. So no matter who's the next president, there will be a question about it. So that's something that we need to consider, actually. that is an open discussion now in South Korea.
We mentioned China already, but are the growing ties between North Korea and Russia weakening North Korea's relations with China, or are they complementary?
I think North Korea is going back to something it hadn't really done since the Cold War, which is playing like Moscow against Beijing. Under the Cold War, they were doing this all the time, but then afterwards, under Yeltsin, this was not possible. And frankly speaking, even under Putin, his interest in North Korea was limited, really. But now this has clearly changed, right? So I do think that, this affects relations between North Korea and China in a negative way. I wouldn't exaggerate though, because I do think that China is not happy with this relationship, but at the end of the day, it will continue to support North Korea because it's a buffer state, all the reasons that we know. I mean, that's not going to disappear. And we have seen actually in recent weeks that trade between China and North Korea has actually increased. That's what satellite imagery tells us, which I think suggests that, China is not completely unhappy with this relationship, because at the end of the day, this relationship between North Korea and Russia, as I said, I don't think is good for China because it reduces his level ability to shape North Korean foreign policy. But I think, on the other hand, it is an issue for the US, it is an issue for South Korea, for Japan as well. So from that perspective, that's good for China.
Ramon, and finally, what about the United States? I mean, it seems that Donald Trump so far hasn't focused on North Korea at all or very little. Why do you think that is? So it seems surprising a bit, because given the roller coaster of statements and activities during his first administration, and also considering that Trump appeared to have a personal fondness for Kim.
Yes, no, that's a good question as well. I mean, I do think that the focus of, not his focus, but his administration's focus on his so-called peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, the negotiations with Iran, plus China being the main focus, mean that, he has mentioned North Korea, said he wants to meet with Kim as well, and they get along and all those things. I think it will come, but I do think he needs to solve other issues first. And the other thing, of course, is that he's really, really focused on domestic issues, right? Really focused on this. Well, tariffs are not only domestic, or it has an international component, but chasing against his perceived enemies, all the war against wokeness he has mentioned, his war against universities. I think there's too much on his plate, but I think this will come. But I also think that this has shown that it's not the top priority. I mean, probably some of his advisors, I don't know if he listens to them, but probably have told him that dealing with North Korea is not as easy as it looks like, right? And in his campaign clerks, he promised to focus on Russia, Ukraine, so he has to deliver on that. And he promised to focus on the tariffs, so he's delivering on that. And China continues to be the main focus, right? And I think that matters.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.